Welcome back to part 3 about refugee background students and their transitions into mainstream schooling. So in part 2 video, we looked at what came out of the research and the results, the data, what were students' social, academic and institutional experiences throughout that transition from language school to mainstream school. So let's see what we can make of this. Where is the meaning in it all and how can we move forward? Firstly, the research comes up with some new understandings about transition that haven't really been talked about in the literature so far. The first key finding is that transition is a very complex, very messy and rather non-linear and individual experience for every single unique student. And that's so of every educational transition, but particularly so for refugee background students. You might recall in part 1, or part 2 rather, we looked at that processes of transition in the linear arrow where there were very discrete stages that happen throughout transition, whereas really in reality they overlap and they're long-term and quite messy, and they don't stop just after the first day at mainstream school. You might also remember that there were a lot of inconsistencies amongst the schools and within the schools about these processes of transition. So you can see it is a very complex process. As I mentioned, it is very long. It's very hard to pinpoint a point of time that transition happens when it starts and finishes, particularly finishes, because each student's different, will have different needs. But you can see that there are 3 non-finite overlapping stages. So I've called these the preparatory transition, early transition, and continuing transition. So in the first phase of transition, the students at the language school are preparing for their transition. That involves the enrolment process, talking with the English language school's transition officer, and getting their uniform, or lots of little things that help them prepare for transition. The second phase of early transition is when they're actually going into the mainstream school in that first parts of the term. Could be weeks, it could be months, and just being able to orient themselves to the new school surroundings and culture. And the third phase of transition is called continuing transition, where there's this ongoing back and forth and side to side movement where they're starting to feel like they belong, they're being integrated and they're welcomed into the school community and feel like they're becoming a bit more of an expert in their knowledge of how it all works. The third finding that's really important is that the social domain of transition is absolutely key for all of these students. So we have the 3 domains of transition: institutional, academic and social, and you can see that everything revolved around making connections with others around them, other students, their peers, making friendships with teachers, and that was at the heart of their confidence in being able to study well or to integrate themselves at an institutional level. So what we as teachers need to be looking at is how to help them support and build up these social connections and feel welcomed and part of the school. And lastly, legitimizing and including students' funds of knowledge is absolutely a priority. Moving in with this additive perspective where students can do and are able in the classroom and in the schools, and playing on those capacities when we talk about helping to support them integrate into transition well into schools. So in the first video, I spoke a little bit about Jim Cummins' work, which framed part of the theories of how I wanted to view transition. And there were these 2 different practices that happen in schools, like a mini society, of how power is used in a balanced or imbalanced way. The first way that power can be used is in coercive ways, and they were ways ultimately that inhibited transition. So firstly, how did that result in impacting the students in transition? There was a lot of inconsistency in the processes amongst and between schools, and the result of that was this disconnect and isolation amongst schools. So really, the English language school and the mainstream schools ought to be working a little bit better and more connected to create better bridges for students as they make that jump between one and the other. Sadly, amongst the mainstream schools involved in my research, I found that there were quite low priorities for EAL students generally within the schools. They had a lot of issues to be dealing with, and EAL students, particularly quiet Karen background ones, were not at the forefront of what they needed to be thinking about. So that meant that often they were quite sidelined and forgotten about. And also to keep in mind that even though some of these schools and the teachers meant well, had very good intentions, their actions, the practices and words or lack of can still be a coercive practice and have an impact for students in this situation. So looking at the things that were working well and that helped facilitate transition were these collaborative practices. So the first thing was this informal systemic support. So there weren't any formalized programs for transition for these students, but somehow teachers did come together and informally assist students and families in this journey between the two schools. There's all this amazing hope for connection that students and families have that helped create friendships and networks between other students and teachers. And ultimately, EL teachers and departments in mainstream schools really act as student advocates. And if they notice some issues happening or they might need support outside of the school, they enact and they make that happen without the guidance of leadership teams in their school. They just do that off their own accord and sometimes even with their own money. So that support network is unofficial, but it's a very integral part of their support at the mainstream school. I also found that best practice teaching, as it is known, is highly beneficial for refugee background and EAL students. That includes things like realizing that whatever key learning area you are teaching, that you are doing that through the English language, and so language needs to be talked about and taught explicitly and broken down and unpacked. And that's best practice for all students, not just EAL students. And also, students' funds of knowledge are integral and highly significant in integrating into teaching and learning. And this should be done, again, as best practice teaching for all students from all teachers. This is one of my favorite pictures that the students drew. It's by a student called Yoshu, and he had this incredible determination and enthusiasm and optimism about his learning and his ability and his confidence to do well and what that meant for his future life in Australia. So his belief was that by improving his English, all skills in his English, his writing, his listening, his speaking, and his reading, that he could improve his academic ability, and then that would give him really strong foundations to go forth into society and do something with his skills in Australia. So he's not a particularly muscly guy, but here he is, just like Tarzan or Superman, and he's got a massive notebook with lots of writing and a big pencil. So even his tools for language are highly important. So that's how important and how valued school is, education is, learning is for these students. And we spoke about funds of knowledge. What I've done is I've broken them into different categories of funds or capacities and skills. And you can see that illustrated in Yoshu's picture there. So things like personal characteristics, their sociocultural skills, their linguistic capacities. And this is highly relevant for refugee background students because they might not have literacy in English, but they're highly literate or even highly plurilingual when they come into schools. Their academic capacities, their unique abilities, and their interpersonal networks, which are very strong, particularly outside of the school community. So what do we do with all of this? I wanted to bring all of these findings together, and I've put them into a new model of transition. So you can see here on the left that we've got funds of knowledge. What does that mean? It means students' individual funds, and that, as I mentioned just before, can be broken into 6 different categories. And we've also got support networks, which is a highly important fund of knowledge that can be used and brought into learning and teaching and transition. And all of that contributes towards student agency. Now, these funds of knowledge are then mediated by the practices at the school. Are the practices of teachers and leadership teams and even peers collaborative? If they are collaborative for the most part, you'll find that funds of knowledge of the students are valued, acknowledged, and legitimized and put into teaching and learning. If they are for the most part coercive, you'll find that they mediate then the funds of knowledge, and the detriment is to their learning and the outcome of their learning in a negative way. And ultimately, this all leads to transition outcomes. How are the students experiencing and developing in their institutional, academic, and social domains? Well, not so well, a little bit of both. So keep in mind that this is not linear, it's not one or the other, it's all very complex and it overlaps at times as well, but this is a nice way to view transition and also development and integration in schools for these students. So I want to finish on this really beautiful picture, again drawn by Yoshu. I asked him about what he wants for his future, and he came up with this quite remarkable drawing. So he's drawn Australia, my sincere apologies, Tasmania, and he's drawn himself as the tree sprouting out of the centre of Australia, and it's laden with fruit and blossoming. And here he tells me, when he explains his picture to me, that I want to grow my country. So remember the big muscly guy, so he's going to learn English and he's going to succeed at school and really increase his academic capacities, and he's going to bring all of that into his future, into Australian society. He's going to contribute back and he's going to show his gratitude to this country. All of the students in some way or the other have this eternal optimism, positivity, value of education, and extreme resilience through great challenges, to just keep thinking positively about what they were experiencing and how grateful they were for the chance at education. And this all also drew into their future dreams about how they wanted to contribute to Australian society. So we as teachers can use this amazing optimism and be aware and acknowledge their great value of education. And what an amazing, beautiful opportunity for us as educators to have these kinds of students in our classroom. I had this picture commissioned by a professional artist, Yuiko Uto, and she incorporated Yoshu's picture of the blossoming tree in Australia and showed the key findings from my research. So the student is central to everything that occurs throughout the transition process, because they have agency and they should be empowered to lead their journey of transition as they see fit. They have the answers to the questions that we're asking. So they're placing the pieces of the puzzle into the right places, but we're supporting them as stakeholders in this transition process. So who are we? We are the English language school. We are the transition officer. We are the family. We are the external community. We are the teachers and the leadership team at the new mainstream school, and we are the students at the mainstream school. Anybody who has an interest and a passion for helping integrate these refugee background students and EAL students into mainstream schooling and inherently into wider society has some kind of active role to play in these students' transitions. So from this, I developed some recommendations for how we can improve students' experiences throughout transition, and they come under three categories. So the first category is valuing learners in transition. What does this mean? It means recognizing and privileging their funds of knowledge. And it also means empowering them to drive their own transition with support from the key stakeholders. The second category is prioritizing EAL in schools. What does that mean? So it's looking at different school practices, what's working, what's not working, doing a big audit and kind of changing things around a bit for the better, because if it's better for refugee backgrounds and EL students, it's going to be better for the whole school. The second one, recommendation is looking at implementing inclusive and whole school approaches and culturally responsive pedagogies. I've got a lot more information in my thesis, which you can find in the University of Melbourne's repository in the library online. So if you want to look at that, you can, but just keep in mind that diversity and inclusion is a really big priority for at least Victoria's state government. And this should be a priority for all schools across the entire region. The third category of my recommendations is pushing for systemic change for equitable education. And what does that mean? It's looking at things like establishing a formalized bridging program. So there's a lot of consistency across schools, within schools, about what we're providing, what support we're providing to families and students. It's also looking at creating collaborative transition support networks that similar, to early childhood to primary transitions. It would be great if key stakeholders could come together and create some kind of network that supports these big jumps from language school into mainstream school. It's also looking at developing a transition policy statement in the likes of the early childhood to primary transitions that we have already, specifically for refugee background and or EAL students moving into mainstream school settings. And lastly, designating transition specific funding for these students. There is specific funding for transition, for example, for early childhood to primary settings and primary to mainstream school settings in Year 7, but not for refugee backgrounds. And I would argue that they are the ones that have higher needs, more complex needs, and require greater levels of support. There's a lot that can be done to support these students, and I know that we're all capable of doing it. This is something that I'm very passionate about, so I'd love to hear your feedback, any comments, any ideas and suggestions you have. I'm going to try and keep publishing about this particular area, but I'd love to hear your thoughts and your experiences, so please feel free to contact me at any stage. Thank you.